assessments, projective testing, which is a type of psychological assessment, and how both can help inform the therapeutic process. Okay, is this too loud? Okay. We live in a number-based society, right? We tend to identify one another based on a number. As adults, that number tends to be income. So how a person is doing is somehow equated to an income, right? As adults, if you are making $100,000 a year, suddenly you're okay. Somewhere along the lines, we decided to equate positive mental health with an income. School-age children aren't immune to that mentality, right? Ask a parent how your child is doing, and the first thing that they'll say is either, great, my child has a 4.0, or horrible, my child's doing poorly, 2.0. Somehow we started to equate how a child is doing based on a number, based on their GPA, right? As if that 4.0 or whatever it is tells us anything about the child. Automatically it tells us that the child has good positive study skills, they're high achieving, but it really doesn't tell us how that child is feeling. I've had a teacher tell me, well, that girl is cutting herself. How is she cutting herself? She's a 4.0 student. But somehow we've been conditioned to protect one another based on a number. So those individuals that are high achieving are untouchable. I call it the invisible barrier, right? You're high achieving, you must be okay. You have a lot of money, you must be okay. So what I want this presentation to show you is what numbers can tell us and what numbers cannot tell us. So on one hand, numbers are important. They can tell us a story, but on the other hand, they can't tell us a lot of things. So learning is, there's two sides to learning. There's the number side, which is ultimately what psychological assessments are. We measure a child's IQ, their achievement, their motor skills, their attention, their concentration, number-based, right? But learning is also humanistic. There's another side to learning, the humanistic side. The side that we're trying to pull out of our schools, right? We're trying to make it more mechanical, more number-based. Number tests, math tests, NWEA scores, standardized testing. We're trying to pull out the humanistic part that's ultimately affecting our children's learning, but we're not focused on that. We're focused more on the interactive cognitive part, the number part. This is important. I'm going to show you how it's important, but this is also important. I'm going to show you how that is important as well and how this ultimately affects learning. Here's my ethics disclaimer before I start. I'll be providing case examples because I feel like they help out more getting an understanding. None of the information has any identifiable factors. You won't identify the individuals. Any identifying factors or any factors that I do say will be distorted, okay? I'll provide a pseudonym, and I do have permission from the parents anyways. So that's my ethics disclaimer, nobody sue me. Got it? Okay, so let me show you what numbers can do. A typical psychological assessment will range between about 5 hours. It's a very comprehensive look at the child, right? Looking at IQ, memory, executive functioning, motor skills, academic, etc., right? Depending on the question that's being asked, we will pull different tests to see how we can best respond to the question. Are you hearing feedback? Okay. So a typical psychological assessment will measure a trait, a behavior, a skill, and then compare it with individuals of the same age and gender across the United States, and then we get to a comparison of how your child is doing. One of the main questions we get asked is, does my child have a learning disability? A learning disability, back when I was being trained, we used to approach it from a discrepancy model. We used to look at the child's IQ, what they're capable of doing, and then look at the child's achievement. And if there's a discrepancy between what the child's producing and what they're capable of doing, we used to call it a learning disability. We've moved more towards a discrepancy model, a deficiency model, I apologize. If we can identify 3 or more cognitive weaknesses in the child's cognitive profile, and that is ultimately affecting their learning, we can call it a learning disability. So I'm going to walk you through how we come up with if this individual has a learning disability. So parents bring this child in, they have concerns with reading, they think there may be a reading disability. So DSM-5 identifies a learning disability in reading, writing, or math. Okay? So they think their child may have a reading disability. So we start off. These are the classification of scores. These are the numbers that I want you to look for. So anything within 90 to 109 standard score is in the average range. Anything, scale score of 8 to 11 is in the average range. So anything above that is a strength for the child. Anything below that is a weakness. Okay? When we're doing assessments, we also are looking for strengths. We want to see the strengths of the child so that we can utilize them, right? Very similar to my patients when they come in and they say, hey, I had a great week today. I have nothing to talk about. Well, we want to hear about the positives so that we can utilize the positives during weeks that aren't so great. So these are the numbers that we're trying to reach, 90 to 109, 8 to 11. So I give the child an intelligence test, an IQ test, looking to see what the child is capable of doing. I'm not going to go through each index. You'll be here all night. But what I want you to look at is their verbal comprehension and their visual spatial. Verbal comprehension is how the child is processing verbal information, information, comprehension, vocabulary, and how the child, visual spatial is how the child is processing nonverbal information. Think puzzles, blocks, pictures. You can see that there's a discrepancy between the verbal comprehension and the visual spatial. If a child is right-hand dominant, their right hand is controlled by the left side of the brain, right? And if the child is left-handed, their left hand is controlled by the right side of the brain. Verbal comprehension is representative of the left side of the brain. Visual spatial is representative of the right side of the brain. So from this data, we're starting to see that this child may have a learning disability, but it's more in their nonverbal skills, right? And this is the cognitive profile that tends to confuse people. We tend to equate intelligence based on a child's verbal ability. Well, how can the child have any issues? They speak so well. Their vocabulary is so well. They're so verbose, right? This is the profile that tends to confuse teachers. Well, the child is doing so well with their verbal skills, how can they have any problems elsewhere? So we're automatically seeing that this might be a learning disability and it might be a split between the right and left hemisphere, okay? This is the WIPSI, which is a type of IQ test. It's very auditory, visual based, I'm sorry. So it relies a lot on visual information and how a child processes visual information. So automatically I'm thinking, if this is a learning disability, and if it is a learning disability in reading, is it based in auditory processing, how the child is hearing information, or is this how a child is processing information? And you'll see how the evaluation unfolds. So ideally, we want these indexes to be uniform, to have the same number. But because they're not, we know that the child's cognitive development is not uniform. There are some areas that have strengths and some areas that obviously have weaknesses. And so we can't interpret the full scale IQ. Their overall cognitive ability is not interpretable at 78. We'll look at their general ability index, and that's an 83. So overall, the child is able to, the general ability is within the low average range of intelligence. Not horrible, but within the low average range. So we add more pieces of information to the puzzle. So these are what we identified from the IQ test. So we give her an achievement test. That is a reading test. That's one part of it, right? I've given her several reading assessments. She obviously has a reading concern. So I'm comfortable in saying this child has a learning disability in reading. But now I'm trying to see if it's specifically a nonverbal learning disability. As you can see, her expressive vocabulary, so vocabulary or information is how the child expresses themselves and how the child understands information. So both expressive and receptive. How the child is expressing vocabulary and how the child is understanding. There's two parts to it. She's very verbose, she can express her language, but she doesn't quite understand language when it comes to reading especially. So I want to know if this child has a reading disability in phonemic awareness, or if it's in just in auditory or visual processing. Phenomes are, phonemic awareness is the child's ability to understand that words are made up of different letters, and those letters make sounds, and you blend those letters together to make words, right? Her phonemic awareness is strong. So the interventions that we would do would not be in phonemic awareness, right? That's why I have a little bit of concern when a child goes to a tutoring center and they identify that there's a reading concern, and then they just pair them up with a very gifted high schooler and then call it an intervention. But sometimes it's more than that. One more piece of the puzzle to add, like I said, the right hand is controlled by the left side of the brain, the left hand is controlled by the right side of the brain. We already think that the right part of the brain is underdeveloped compared to the left side. I give her a motor dexterity test. A motor dexterity test assesses a child's motor skills. So there's a pegboard and there's holes, and they will they'll put the pegs into the holes as quickly as they can, and we time them and compare them with individuals her age and gender. So if we look at her dominant hand, she needed to complete the task in 63 seconds. She completed it in 122 seconds. So 1 standard deviation or more below the norm. There's a concern there. But now we look at the non-dominant hand, her left hand. Again, it's controlled by the right side of the brain. We see she completed it in 180 seconds when she should have completed it, the average, within 65 seconds. 3 standard deviations below the norm. There's a concern there. So she would require occupational therapy to improve the motor skills and to ultimately improve the right side of the brain. This is complex, kind of straightforward, but a nonverbal learning disability. This is the profile that numbers can tell us. If we would have just given her a basic reading test, we would not have identified these concerns and then geared her on the right path towards intervention. So this is what numbers can tell us. So now let me show you what numbers can't tell us. Projective testing, for those people that love numbers, hate projective testing, right? Because they're very subjective, they're open to interpretation. What the idea is that a child will project an aspect of themselves onto a sheet of paper or a stimulus in front of them. So they'll project a feeling or an emotion that they have onto this sheet of paper. It's very difficult to get a 6-year-old to come into session and just start talking about how they feel. They don't typically do that. But when we give them a projective testing and we ask them to draw something, an aspect of themselves or how they feel will be projected onto the sheet in front of them. So in this case, I give a child a blank sheet of paper and I ask them to draw whatever they want. So sometimes I'll prompt and I'll say, draw whatever makes you happy or draw whatever makes you sad, because I want to see what the child taps into. So I'm going to walk you through this projective testing. Can you see it? So this is what the child drew. I asked the child to draw whatever they wanted. They start off by drawing a hill and a tree and a sun. Typically when I ask this child to draw something, they draw rainbows and butterflies and flowers and everything's positive, but they're throwing computers at school. Right? They almost have like a dissociative quality to it when I ask her about it. So tell me about what happened at school. What are you talking about? What happened at school? I didn't do anything. She doesn't want to talk about it. It's very scary for her to talk about. But we use projective testing to get the child to express how they're feeling onto the sheet of paper. So she starts off, and I'm going to walk you through it. She draws a hill, and she draws a tree, and then something happens. She taps into something, and she starts drawing more things. She starts drawing this girl, and she identifies that this is me. So sometimes with projective drawings, the kids will draw somebody of the same gender but won't identify that that is me, right? And then they speak freely about themselves but as a separate entity from them. So she drew herself and said that that was me. When this child draws herself with black hair, she tends to be identifying with dad. So dad, that is an issue in himself. Dad does to his daughter what he does to me. He'll call, we try to bring him into session, and he refuses to be any part of it. He does the same thing to his daughter. She calls, she wants him to come, and he doesn't show up. Doesn't matter, she's identified with him. Not only is she identifying with her father, not only am I my father's daughter, I am my father. So part of our work was getting mother to understand that, because mother tended to speak very ill about dad in front of her daughter. So if mom said something, you know, dad was horrible, that meant I'm horrible. Dad is mean, that meant I'm mean. And mother couldn't comprehend that her daughter had identified with her dad. So strong that when I asked her one time to draw me a picture of a family, she drew 10 dads, 10 of her fathers. She saw him maybe tops twice in the whole year. Doesn't matter, she's identified with him. So she starts drawing, and then she draws these two. And I'm not going to give you the gender and the age, but she has said that they're kids and she's hurt them and she's thrown them over the hill. Dad has a family of his own now with some kids. But if you ask her about it, I love them. I love my siblings. They're great. We get along so well. Right? It's scary for her to talk about, but she's showing us. So this is a child that carries that with them every day in school, but is expected to learn in the same way as everybody else. Then she did something that was really important. It was like a breakthrough. She gave it a name. I don't know if you guys can read it. She called it Hell Queen. Kind of disturbing, yeah. But she gave it a name. So Dr. Shabak often talks about kids having their emotions stuck in the limbic system, and we want them to start talking about it, to move it away from the limbic system, more towards the frontal cortex. We call it name it to tame it, right? Remember feeling sometimes very anxious and sad, and you're not quite aware of why you feel that way, but once you can put it into words, it diminishes its effect. So she gave it a name. Now with that, she can now talk about how she's feeling separate as to who she is. It's safer for her to talk about. But in therapy, we also have to be very careful that we don't enable the split, right, between good and bad self. We want her to know that we accept this Hell Queen part of her as part of who she is and not a separate entity. So this is what numbers can't show us. This is not going to be shown on a math test. It may be reflected on the NWA scores or whatnot, but it's not going to tell us unless we look beyond the number, right? Back to that humanistic part, the emotions part. That child is going to school carrying those emotions. She's not going to be able to sit for 6 to 7 hours and listen the way that somebody that doesn't have all this anguish inside of them does. But if we don't see past the numbers, we're going to miss that part. I was once doing an IQ test, and I'm not going to give you my IQ questions, but the question was regarding being afraid or being scared, and the girl said, oh, you know, well, scared is when your stepfather comes into the room and you know what's about to happen. We're thinking about numbers and something else shows up. And if we don't look beyond the number, we look beyond the cognitive processes, we miss the whole picture of what's going on. This child is not easy to have in the classroom, right? Unless the teacher is very aware of her frustration tolerance, this is a child that is going to be very disruptive in classes. The relationship between teacher and student is also very important towards the learning process. Very similar to the relationship between therapist and patient. Much of the success of our therapy is based on the relationship between therapist and patient. And very much like that, teacher and student's relationship also impacts the child's learning. And let me show you how. There's the parent comes in and brings their child and says they want the testing to show that their child has ADD. Their child has already been diagnosed with ADD. They want the testing to substantiate that, to prove it for IEP purposes, so individualized education plan, for special education purposes. During the clinical interview, they tell me that the child has been coming home very upset lately. He comes home, he doesn't want to do his homework, it's not very like him. There's a concern there. They think there might be tension between he and the teacher, but they're not 100% sure. And they don't really at that point care. They're really focused more on the ADD diagnosis. So we do the ADD evaluation, and yes, the child does have symptoms of ADD, and the data supports it. But I'm still thinking about what they told me about the teacher. So I send the teachers a Connors. A Connors is a behavioral questionnaire. It helps us with diagnosing purposes. So we want to see how the child is acting in school compared to how the child is acting at home. And we use it to support our diagnosis. Truth be told, I really didn't care what she said. I wanted to see how she was responding to this child. So what the Connors does is provide an impression index. It tells us if the person responded overly positive, overly negative, or if they were neutral. Okay? So when you look at this, these are the typical numbers. And anything between 40 to 59 is an average score. Anything above 59 in the 60 range is the teacher is seeing a concern. Anything above 70 and the teacher is seeing a lot of concerns, right? This was the response of the teacher. Oh, you're probably not going to see the numbers. Negative all across. So according to the teacher, child fits criteria for not only ADD, but learning disabilities, executive functioning concerns. He's probably ODD, oppositional defiance. He's probably somewhere on the spectrum with regards to peer relationships. Negative all across. It was so negative that the Connors became invalid. We couldn't use it, right? We couldn't use it for diagnostic purposes, but it told us about the relationship between the child and the teacher. Point blank, the teacher, I'm sorry.
So what things, like, I've always been weak in my practice. I don't use scales, which I probably should use more. But the reason is because I feel like the teacher can project a lot onto the student. Is that what you kind of see?
Oh, yeah.
He's projecting her own or his own negative emotions onto the student?
It could be. Yeah, yeah. It could be a lot of things. So the student, not only, the teacher point blank didn't like the student. And not only did the teacher not like the student student knew that the teacher did not like him, and he had internalized it. My teacher does not like me, therefore I must be unlikable. And he was carrying that with him every day in school and after school, right? And we asked different teachers, and they didn't match this. So it wasn't similar all across his other classes, right? That relationship ultimately impacted this child's learning without the teacher or anybody even realizing it. So, if you take away anything from this, take away the fact that we need to look beyond the number, right? Look beyond the A's, look beyond the 4.0s, look beyond the diagnosis, look beyond the income. There's a story behind that. So in the same way that you and I maybe share similar demographics, our stories are different. Right? What led us to this point of our lives is different. And once we stop looking for those stories, once we start focusing only on the numbers, we're losing the child. Let's kind of bring it back into the culture. So school in itself is difficult, right? Add to that adolescence, which is a time of great change, right? One of the developmental tasks of adolescence is to separate yourself from the family nucleus and create an identity of your own. Now, how does that look within the Arab culture? What do you mean you're going to separate from me? Are you kidding? You're going to have your own identity? Are you serious? You are an extension of me, right? You are not your own person, you are an extension of me. So your behavior reflects me. You act stupid, I look stupid, and I'm not going to have that. And it causes a perfect storm. The concerns that we're seeing in the community, young adults, didn't start in young adult. They started in middle school and in high school. They just are able to manifest now as young adults. So now they have cars where they can, they get angry, they can get in their car and go speed off or go to social interactions and drink and use other recreational drugs. The anger that they're feeling or the sadness, or whatever the emotion may be, was always there, but it was protected by something. It was protected by an A. It was protected by, likes on Facebook or whatever it is. Well, that person must not have problems. They're popular. The problems have always been there, but we just need to look beyond the number and look for the story. All right, that's my presentation.
So you brought up the cultural thing now.
I knew you were going to point to that. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I mean, I have not a different view than you. I just have a different approach to culture, because I think that it's fine that the culture is different in
Yeah,
itself. That,
yeah.
But the problem becomes is when you bring, in a Western society, the culture, the bigger culture is different than what our culture is.
Right.
So that's where I think the problem is. It's how do we identify what the culture actually expects from the kids and use that to our advantage, rather than I think telling us to maybe change the culture.
Well, yeah.
I don't know. Like I don't know how to find the balance, but. For example, in a village in Lebanon, that works. You're an extension of your father, you're an extension of your mother, right? I mean, it just, it sort of works, not always.
I wouldn't say it works.
Maybe not 90%.
It's just not shown, right? Because it's more protected, it's more covered.
Different cultures have, I think, like, it works, like, for example, here in Western society, it doesn't, the separation of individuation that an adolescent goes through, it doesn't even work for, it doesn't always work for non-Arabs and Americans
right.
or white people too.
Right,
it doesn't
right.
work for them all the time, just like our system doesn't always work for us.
Right.
So how do we, I guess, find a way to use what our culture, our bedrocks of our culture to alleviate that problem so that the person doesn't face these problems as a young adult?
You're going to have to find a happy, I don't have the answers. Nobody has the answers, right?
It's a more of a discussion.
Say that again?
Yeah.
That's not a fair question to ask.
No, I have all the answers, and that's why I'm going to save all these kids.
Actually, it's more of a discussion.
Yeah, it's a discussion, of course. There isn't an answer to that, right? Because we don't want individuals to conform, right? We don't want them to change their culture. But we want awareness within parents that a child has a natural tendency, an insatiable tendency to want to fit within the dominant culture, right? And so it's really trying to find a balance between what the family wants and what the parents, or what the child ultimately wants.
Since you brought up culture, I think more within the Middle Eastern culture is we're locked in. As a parent, we don't want to see beyond because there's no need to.
It's scary to look beyond.
It is. It really is. Now, especially in the community where you live in, it's also that makes a difference. But if you live, let's say, in a multicultural environment, you have Christian, Jews, Arabs, and all that, your view is totally different. But when you live in a society where it's all one, like I'm going to use Dearborn as an example. Like when I moved to Dearborn Heights, it was a culture shock for me, even though they were my own people. And raising my kids was totally different when I raised them in Nova and Livonia than when I moved here. And that played a role in their education, and it played a role in, wait a minute, oh my God, my daughter's a 4.0, she better stay 4.0. I mean, what are they going to say? My daughter here's a single mom raising 2 girls. She better have that A because
it's a reflection of us.
We're closed in. We're not open-minded, sadly to say. And we hide things under the rug. And that plays a major, I think, a lot of key role in children's education. Is we don't open up. We don't say, okay, my son is a C. So what if he's a C? He tried his hardest. I'm proud my son is a C. I'm proud my son if it's an A. Whatever it is, we don't have a balance, sadly to say. What do you say on that part?
So,
do you agree with me on that?
So definitely. What we tend to do is when a child, let's say, has a C, right? So when I said, ask a parent how your child is doing, and they say, great, they have a 4.0, well, that also has the opposite effect. You get parents that say, oh, horrible, he's got a 2.0 or whatever it may be. So we tend to dismiss all the different aspects about the child and just focus on that 4.0. So who cares about the moral component or their personality or their social ability or their scholastic, whatever the case may be, we focus on just that number because that number represents something.
And I see when I was working with the school districts for 20 years, I saw that a lot with Middle Eastern parents than I did with the other cultures, sadly to say. Like I had a parent once said, why is my son getting a D? I said, this was his ability. He's trying his hardest to get it from an E to a D. For me, when a student from an E to a D, to me that's honors as a teacher, that I've accomplished something. That he was failing, but by the time 5th grade came, I was able to get him from a D to a C. So
improvement.
To pass. Now for parents within our culture, they can't accept that. So what do we need to work on, or workshops or training, to get these parents to accept that it's okay, C is okay, as long as you know they're trying their hardest and they're putting that effort.
I think the key is to make sure that the person's trying their hardest. It's not like a D is okay for everybody, or E is okay for everybody. You have to try it, as long as the person's putting effort. I don't think we want to be also like some of the more, what's going on in the dominant culture where everybody is exactly the same, where everyone is at the same level no matter what their achievement is. We do have to give, I think we have to give proper credit to achievement. But I think everybody's at a different level where what they can achieve. But to find what they can achieve and push them to achieve what they can achieve should be the goal. Not for everybody to be an A student or everybody to have that number, but everybody to be able to be pushed to their ability. Right? So I don't think that it would be like some people, it just wouldn't be, if they're getting D's and they're saying, well, and they're not really trying, then that's a problem. Yeah, so we have to, I think we need to really be nuanced in that as well.
Right, there's a story behind it. So we're not just going to say, oh, you have a D, great, well, accept it for exactly what that is. Go ahead, Emma.
Next.
I think something important with the parents that I've seen growing up, I mean, I'm still a student, but, and my mother's been in the school district and she's seen it as well, is that I had a lot of influence at home growing up. And a lot of parents will come in and they're frustrated because their child is failing, because the teacher is not doing anything. But I think what's more important is that the parent needs to know that it also goes back to the home.
Thank you.
And one teacher cannot look after 30 kids. They can only do so much versus one-on-one sessions. When parents are not paying attention, they don't care, they're running. Like I remember growing up, I wasn't allowed to go out anywhere during the week because that was all studying. But that's not what I'm seeing right now. You know, and I'm not saying it's for everybody, but that's why you have to remind parents that you also have a large impact on your child's education, and we need to play a role at home.
But here's the problem with that, and I agree with you to a large extent, but I think the problem is not that parents don't always have the resources. Like there are single moms out there.
Or the cognitive ability or awareness.
Or the cognitive ability.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And that's fine, but I mean, I know a lot of people, there's tutoring services, but if you're going to take your child at home, and then you don't need so much TV, and then if you don't turn your assignment, that's fine, because I never learned, so that's okay, and I was trying. Versus finding resources. And you don't always have to pay money. You don't always have to, you know, you can find a neighbor, you can find a friend, a cousin, like someone that leave them at school, find like a kids club or something, I don't know what it is now, but you know, there's always something you can do. I think that's what's important to tell them.
So my, I can't believe I forgot to mention this. I'm ABD, which means all but dissertation. So but I went back and got getting my doctorate in education. And my dissertation is on the development of the Arab American adolescent and how that looks within the context of the United States. So not only the identity development, but what is their perception? What does it mean to be Arab American for students? I don't know that answer because we haven't asked those questions, right? I did a pilot study and I had asked, you know, what does it mean to be Arab American? And they gave me demographics. You know, oh, it means that I'm whatever, Muslim or whatever the case may be, but they didn't go deep. I don't know what the assumption or what the perception of Arab Americans are on their identity. So within the African American culture, there's this acting white assumption, right, especially for African American males. So we're not going to academically achieve anything because that would mean that I'm acting white. What does that look like in the Arab American culture? And we're not going to know that unless we ask those questions. Imagine, you know, that your child goes to school for 1 hour and learns math, but then goes to school in the same class and learns something about themselves, learns something about their development. How important would that be, right? But we're not asking these questions in school because we're hyper-focused on math and writing and spelling, and that's important, but that's only one piece of the puzzle.
Well, why should that be the responsibility of the school? It's the same question as saying, why don't schools teach us taxes?
Say that again, I'm sorry.
It's the same idea as saying, why don't we learn how to do our taxes at school? It shouldn't be the school's responsibility.
It should be a mix of both. Your schools are part of your community. You cannot separate the two, right? And our community is part of the family. You can't separate the two, but we tend to want to. So yes, the family has an impact, but your child is spending 6 to 7 hours in school, right? Their development is ultimately going to be impacted by what is going on in school more so than family.
And schools do teach social science, so that could be part of the social science too. Yeah.
Right. I'm sorry, I think school is sometimes a large social experiment, that it teaches us how to be who we are. So why not utilize that experience? Those relationships that you're having in school, are ultimately going to impact who you are. So why not have those conversations in school? It's not separate between school and home, but it should be more collaborative.
But I've noticed for the 20 years that I was in the school district, parents that were actually involved in the schools, the students were more socially and academically more successful. Do you agree with me from your point? This is from my personal experience for the 20 years that I worked in the school district.
Generally speaking,
Yes.
Definitely so. Definitely so. So of course, not everything is absolute.
No, it's not 100%.
Right, but the more involved families, there's studies on that show, the more involved families are, the more a child will be academically successful. And the more involved the child is in the community, the more academically successful they are. It's an interactive process.
So what do we need to improve it within our own community? What still needs to be done? Because I feel schools are doing their jobs. Teachers, I believe 99.9% are doing their jobs. So how do we approach it? This is from what I've seen by working in the Gas School Districts, by working in 3 Islamic schools and 3 private charter schools. I see that we have how do we improve? Teachers are doing their job, it's the parents. How do we get the parents more to be involved? Parents that are within our culture.
But right when you say that, teachers are doing it, you're automatically putting yourself in a situation where you're like, I'm doing whatever I can. Everybody could do more, Not everybody has reached the point where that's all I can give. Teachers can always give more, parents can always give more.
But how do you get these parents to get off that chair and do something?
Yeah, they have to want to.
I know the problem is literacy. To me, that's still not an excuse because most of the school districts in the state of Michigan, they're bilingual. They have Arabic departments, they have Spanish, they have all these departments, so translation is not a problem. And I notice that they always use that as an excuse. And one of them is my neighbor, she'll always say, well, I don't know what to do. My son goes to Crestwood, I don't understand what this teacher is saying. I said, you know what, that's an excuse because there is Middle Eastern teachers, there's a Middle Eastern counselors, there is a resource. But how do we get these parents to get up off that chair and do something?
So very
Be
similar.
a little bit more sensitive to the parents. Approach them in a sensitive way where you understand their struggles. That yes, you're illiterate. I understand that. That's gonna be hard. Let's take baby steps. I think that's one way we can approach it. It's not an us versus them. I think immigrant parents have a lot of difficulties. We all hear their children. Yeah, absolutely.
But some are acculturated better than others, and some are able to handle that stress different than
I
others.
know for me, I'm a son of immigrants, obviously, but so was my mom, and her dad came here, he had such a culture shock. He wasn't able to be involved in her school. He couldn't just easily get off the chair and go to the school and be involved. He went to the school once and saw people putting their feet on the table and almost had a heart attack. Like, that's not how schools work in the Middle East. So no, it's not that easy. I don't think it's easy to go tell, my grandfather, get your butt off the chair and let's take you to school. He's not gonna go. So I think we have to just be a little bit more sensitive. Maybe have more forums like this, or have people like Zaina doing her amazing research on what it is to be an Arab American, even tap into the immigrant community, see what their struggles are, to understand and fix through understanding the culture. So yeah, again, I don't take an antagonistic view towards culture. I take culture as a symbiotic view where let's see what the culture is, let's see what their struggles are, and use that as a catalyst for change, rather than tell them, here's what the change is going to be, and you're going to do it this way because the white people do it this way and the black people do it this way, we're going to do it the same way. No, let's understand where we're coming from. Our community is very diverse, and use that to achieve the change that we desire. And it starts by asking the questions.
Exactly what he said.
I think it's unfair to say that about the parents sometimes, because a lot of them put in a lot of effort. It's just they might not be aware of the resources that are available or the different ways of learning. So maybe a child puts in, maybe their oldest child used to put in 4 hours of work and to achieve that 8, versus their younger child who might have a learning disability, but they are an older generation who, when they were in school, learning disabilities weren't a thing. You were either really good at school or you weren't. They didn't have that as much awareness as we do now. And so to them, that younger child is supposed to also put in 4 hours of work like their older brother or sister and get the same result, and they might not be aware that there are different ways and resources available to them to teach that child how to use their strengths in order to reach their fullest potential.
And it's so easy to blame the parents sometimes. I always say raising kids is like catching fish. As soon as, with your hands, as soon as you feel like you got it and it's in control, they slip through your finger and something else happens. So it's easy to blame the parents, but sometimes they're working with what they have, you know?
I think this generation is a lot stronger than we were in terms of absorbing things. And they have a lot more power at home. So we could try to empower the student and give them the resources and inform them, because you know they're going to run home and say, Mom, Dad, you know, look what I can do. Maybe it's hard to send a note home or just give this paper to your parents. Phones and everything. But if you actually tell the children this is what you guys can do, they need to feel empowered and encouraged to do better. Because sometimes maybe they're scared. Maybe they don't know what their capability is. So like giving them that outlet maybe, or using them as the outlet to their parents to let them know. Parents do listen to their children. Sometimes they just want them to stay quiet and they'll do whatever they want. But if they say like, I want to do this, I want to try this, I want to stay after school, I want to do, you know, maybe that's another way, maybe through the children.
One of the biggest resiliency factors for people to be resilient, for children who come from low backgrounds, low income or low socioeconomic status or what have you, is a charismatic adult in their life. It doesn't have to be a parent, it could be a teacher, it could be a counselor, it could be a friend, it could be an older brother. That concept of charismatic adult, there's a lot of literature on that. It's very interesting that a teacher can play that role. As a psychiatrist, I often play that role with my patients as the charismatic adult. You know, sometimes I come down hard on my patients, and then they end up appreciating it. So it depends. Again, there's a lot of literature on these things. I think we just also need to be comfortable with reading scientific papers as professionals, as teachers, as doctors, as therapists. Actually read, go through the journals and see what's being written out there. That's also very important.
Yeah, and what works with one family may not work with another family. So it's really about asking the questions, what is the family dynamic and how you can fit into it. All right, thank you.